for folks to take a look at. But then also reaching out to some of the jurisdictions, being that we, in the Commonwealth, I think we have a pretty wide range of schools that are starting for that, and some of them are AP schools, some have IB programs, and just to reach out to get that testing data, if it has been, if have they seen any improvement for their student SOLs as well, by starting a little sooner, and if they've seen an impact by that. I think that's an important factor to have, and a data point to have to share with folks as well as we kind of go through this decision-making process.
Madam Chair, can I? Just one of the rationales for, and this is just for your information only, one of the rationales that the Commonwealth of Virginia gave to school divisions to be able to start earlier and to get a waiver, it was around student performance. If their student performance was at a very poor performing level, they did allow divisions the opportunity to apply for a waiver, because more instruction before the assessment, the expectation was that they would do better on the assessments. So that's just one data point. I'm going to need to get into it tonight, but we'll see what we can find.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few questions that leap to my mind, and some of them you've already touched on, but I suppose I'll just say them anyway, just as emphasis. Really important to understand what our neighboring jurisdictions are doing, but also what about the jurisdictions where our staff live, given that most of our staff don't live in town, to the degree that that's different from whatever the prior question tells us. Are there any efficiencies in operations that we would potentially gain by aligning closer with one of our neighbors? Are there any points of friction that might arise? You know, are we going to have traffic problems to deal with, things like that? So that's a question in my mind. Would moving the start date affect our hiring competitiveness in either direction? It's an open question in my mind. We've already talked about standardized testing, so won't go there. Are there any issues that this might raise for the general government? I don't know what they would be, but it's a thought in my head, so that's something to think about. And then an earlier start date means we're getting into warmer periods of time, and they are only going to get hotter. And so the question is, does that lead us to any impacts on building energy use, air conditioning, things like that, that might have an impact on the budget in the long haul? And on student learning. You know, there's a lot of research out there that students don't learn as effectively when it's hot. So what are we doing about that? And overall, I will say, I agree, the plan looks very comprehensive. I would also support the idea that if that survey can be moved a little bit earlier, I would encourage doing that, because I think we want to give time for everybody to consider it, time for it to be in there, and starting it earlier just sort of helps with that process. So thank you.
I also might want to work on the research, outreach, you know, just like the pop-up registration. Are there populations that may be harder to reach via email or electronic communications? And, gosh, I forgot what the other one was, but I'll remember. The SAOs. We loop them in and I think make them push out a lot of this too.
Minor observation with regard to Mr. Anderson's point. In my experience, which is universal, the farther south you go, so the warmer climate, the more likely you are to start earlier in the year as opposed to later in the year. And I think that's driven primarily by the fact that, you know, like in the northeast part of the United States, my being from Florida will affects this. I mean, the only time it's really sane to live there is during the summer. So the kids can go to school, start a little bit later, but, you know, it's hot all year round in places like Florida. So I'm not really sure which way that cuts, but it's a point to think about.
And I survey earlier, already one of my points, and the reaching out to our more vulnerable populations and asking how this affects them and our staff who maybe is not as vocal, especially in our bus drivers or cafeteria staff, our custodial staff. How does this impact them as well? Everyone's already made those good points, so thank you.
Great. All right, so can I challenge you then? So I have shared with you what the topics for the drivers were for the work session in October. Greg has sent about 6 questions, many of them he shared with you all tonight. You've raised a lot of questions that I think would be helpful. If you have more questions that would help you in your decision making, If you would send them to me so that we can work on them between now and when the October work session comes, we'd be happy to do that and try to get as many of the answers as possible.
All right, thank you, everyone. That great discussion and the many discussions to come. Next, we will move into our closed meeting. If someone would please read us into closed.
Pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, I move that the board convene a closed meeting for the following purpose: to discuss or consider the identified subject matter. Public safety under section 2.2-3711A19, in particular, discussion of plans to protect public safety as it relates to terrorist activity and briefings by staff members, legal counsel, or law enforcement, or emergency service officials concerning actions taken to respond to such activity or a related threat to public safety.
Thank you, Ms. Linton. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Castillo. Ms. Goodell?
Mr. Castillo? Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mr. Castillo? Ms. Gill? Ms. Gill?
Aye.
Ms. Litton?
Aye.
Mr. Reitinger?
Yes.
And Mr. Webb?
Yes.
Thank you.